Hey, it's your old pal Lucid Stew again, and this time we're going to talk about DreamsCom 2020 and making booths for DreamsCom. If you don't already know, DreamsCom 2020 is a virtual convention for dreams hosted by Media Molecule. Anyone who wants to can build a booth for this convention, but there are some rules. First of all, you must use the Media Molecule DreamsCom booth template, which you can find by searching for DreamsCom. There are a lot of user-created booths up in the Dreamiverse already, but we want the template, which is DreamsCom 2020 Booth Template by J+B and MM Dream Queen. And to get started, all you need to do is remix that element into your own. This year, DreamsCom occurs on June 30th, but your booth submissions are due by 11:59 p.m., presumably Greenwich Mean Time, June 24th, so just over a week if you haven't started. When you get into the element, you will notice that the booth is not centered. Boo! I suggest you center it first before proceeding so you aren't thrown off by this like I was initially. The booth as it stands is 1/2 of a click off center to the left of this view. Move it 1/2 of a click to the right, problem solved. If you do not care about symmetry or accuracy, then it doesn't matter one bit. While I fiddle with centering, let's talk some more about DreamsCom 2020. This is a live stream event, but also an event in dreams. The very best booths will be explored and live streamed by Media Molecule on June 30th at 5 p.m. Greenwich Mean Time, which is also 9 a.m. Pacific Standard Time, noon Eastern Standard Time for those in the US. Australia and Japan, you get screwed because it's the middle of the night for you. After the live stream, all the booths will be sent out into the Dreamiverse in some type of unified form. The showroom floors will feature something like 8 to 10 booths, depending on resource use. I'm not positive what the procedure will be for deciding which booths get grouped, or if there is a procedure. But this is a chance for every Dreams user to showcase some of their content, so if you feel like something you've done has been overlooked, here's your chance to make a flashy booth and promote your content. There are some rules involved. I suggest you check the link in the description for those. I will be discussing some as the video goes on. The most important ones are the following. You can't change the size of the booth, and everything you place must be within the confines of the shape of the booth. Your resource use is limited to 8% gameplay, 10% graphics, and 5% audio. Everything you place in the booth must be made by you, and it must be published public. There are some minor exceptions, and I will address most as we come to them while discussing strategies for effective building, so let's get to it. Let's familiarize ourselves with this element and realize we can utilize copies of its pieces without graphics thermal penalties since we're forced to use it and have already paid for those. There are 3 pieces: the floor back wall, the banner ring, and the cage. The cage is made up of 27 rod pieces. This means we enter the element with 30 things. Our gameplay limit being 8% means the thing budget for our stuff is 770. You're allowed to adjust sculpture detail on these pieces, and I would suggest dialing them back slightly, which will give you about 0.5 percentage point more room in graphics thermo. In this video, I'll be using some copies of the metal rods here. In the booth I'll be submitting for my City Streets kit, I used most of the booth parts to make tables, so there is some utility here that is worth exploring. I think it's a good idea to have a columnar element in case you want to hide undesirable parts of the booth, or to create vertical elements for better drama. I'm going to pick my Desert City column. As an afterthought, I decided to make this entire booth with elements from my old Desert City collection as an example of what you might do with a unified set. You can see this one element bumps us up to 5% graphics, and without optimization you're going to be able to afford 2 pieces like this, and that potentially makes a very boring booth. This particular element is made up of the sandy column and a metal grate as a sort of balcony, so keep in mind what you're bringing into the scene. If you don't need that grate, chuck it and regain the resources, but I'll keep it. I'm going to stack these columns in the corners to partially cover the corner poles. Be careful to stay within the limits of the booth. It doesn't sound like they're going to be super picky about borderline stuff, but do you really want to be left out because you pushed it? As it turns out, I have about as many unique elements in this collection as you can comfortably fit into this booth. You'll notice I have some stuff by Sooty Pinions in here because Sooty Pinions is awesome and their sandstone assets are my favorite in the whole entire Dreamiverse, but they are not mine, so I can't use them in my booth. I'm bringing in a wall and a couple of arch shapes. These are great for dividing areas and directing traffic through your booth and setting up sight lines for emphasis. One thing I'd like to do is match the color of the banner ring part of the booth with the desert wall element I brought into the scene. I'll show you a couple of tricks about how to accomplish that. Normally this is as simple as selecting both elements and bringing up each of their tweak menus. However, this endeavor is complicated here by the wall sculpt being inside of a group. That means we need to bring the wall sculpt out of the group and into the same scope as the banner ring so we can select both. In order to get that wall out of the group, we'll need to grab it, and normally if you do that freehand, you're going to move it. So here's a little trick to get something out of a scope without moving it. You want to turn your grid on and put it at a very coarse grid size, maybe 8 or 16. This way when you grab, you'll need to move the imp very far in order to get it to budge. This will keep it from moving under most circumstances. Now that we have the wall out of the group scope, we can match the colors. You do this by selecting both sculpts. With the tweak menus open as such, tap the color that you want. In this case, it's the beige on the left, the other will change to match. When you do that, the base color of the sculpt is not changed, so you have to turn the paint bucket slider all the way up for the tweak color to overcome the base color. And one more time with the sculpt for the floor and the back wall. Now I'll add a couple of accent pieces and a door. The accent pieces help give life to all the structure that's being put down. I'm probably a little heavy on structure, but that's the way the collection is. The door is significant because you are allowed a doorway gadget to take visitors from your booth to the game, scene, demo, or hub that you are promoting with your booth. The gameplay limit is going to limit you to only one doorway. The protocol for the doorways is that the doorway gadget must be named the same as the scene you want to link to, and that scene must be yours. You don't do any logic work. will hook that up for you based on the name of the doorway. After having done this, one thing I can strongly recommend is not leaving the floor of your booth flat. Giving the interior of your booth some topography gives it additional interest. Also, the whole act of walking upstairs to enter the booth is very powerful and adds a sense that the player is arriving somewhere. Earlier I mentioned the metal grates on the Desert City columns. I decided to do something with them. If you have gameplay to spare, I would very much encourage thinking of unconventional ways to use the various things that make up your booth. In this case, I'll use the metal grates to make a chandelier. And then to connect the chandelier to the support structure, I will use a booth rod and recolor that to match the chandelier. I have a couple of large rocks in the collection that I will add to the booth for some interest. I talked earlier about making sure that your booth objects stay inside the booth. has stated that there is some wiggle room at the top of the structure, but generally try to keep it close. I was trying to think up of a way to use these various props as a railing for these side galleries, and I settled on using the booth rods for that purpose. The scenes these booths will go into will feature a third-person puppet, so you'll probably want to drop one into the element and explore a bit to see if everything is laid out okay. In this case, I'm checking to make sure the steps can be traversed, and it also turns out I made the door too big. so I can go back and adjust that. At this point, everything is dropped into the scene and I have it all set up. Turns out I'm over by 4% on graphics, so it's time to optimize and see how much I can keep. When optimizing a tight group of sculpts like this, I find it useful to concentrate on sculpture detail with scale taken into account. This is especially so since it's pretty likely you're going to miniaturize at least some of your sculpts to get them to fit into the booth, and that opens up some opportunities to drop detail right off the bat. I've gone through and lowered everything as much as I dare, and I'm still at 12% graphics, so I need to start cutting things. My most obvious choice is the very large arch, which I only use one time in the scene. Because of the size, it can only cost so little, and I have another arch in the scene anyway. You are allowed to recolor and paint the outside of your booth. Another minor exception to the boundaries rule are text displayers. They can be on the outside of the booth, but they are required to look like they're on the surface of the booth. You don't want to get too close, otherwise the text will sink into the prop rather quickly as the camera moves away from it. A good distance is somewhere around 1/8 to 1/4 of a tick from the surface. You can add sound and music to your booth, and the good news is you do not have to make it yourself. One stipulation is that all sounds in your booth must be 3D panned so that they don't bleed out of your booth into other booths. The bad news is that nearly any amount of sound or music has the potential to add to your graphics thermo. That has nothing to do with graphics, but is a consequence of shared memory being subcategorized under graphics. Even though this piece of music is not particularly long and doesn't have that many instruments, putting it into the scene put me over the booth limits. So I decided to cut sounds from the timeline until I got back under the limit. And unfortunately, what I ended up with was a pretty short loop of mostly one instrument. I think that's better than nothing, and I think if you want your booth to be dynamic, it needs sound. So I would suggest maybe limiting yourself to 9% graphics before sound to give yourself some extra room to work with. With all that done, we are at the graphics limit and under on gameplay and audio, so this booth would work out just fine. So in this video, we took a look at the upcoming DreamsCom and talked a little about how to put together a booth for that event. I look forward to walking through everyone's booths, and who knows, maybe we'll be neighbors. I'm just now hitting my stride again with Dreams after a couple of days, and there's plenty to talk about happening in the Dreamiverse, so stay tuned. However, that's all for now. Until next time, I'll see you in the Dreamiverse.